Hello, Petal. How you doing? How are things? How's your week going? So, halfway through another week and we've got another chapter for you. Woo! Update on the poll about the live stream of the finale, which would be the second half of the final chapter of Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells and Co., Book 7 by Tom Holt. Bearing in mind, I've already done Book 8, which is a kind of Christmassy one, which is the 8 Reindeer of the Apocalypse. I digress. So the poll is this. Because the last chapter is so long, it's likely I'll record it in 2 goes, just because of my own time constraints. And I was thinking the second half of that chapter, do it as a live stream. Now, I probably won't go on video. I'll probably just be like an audio live stream, but you can get to see a little bit of behind the scenes of just how my processes work. Of course, the chapter will still be produced as a single chapter, and it will basically be put up like any others. Right, now, we do have our lovely, lovely audience. Hello to all of you wonderful, lovely people who keep coming back. We do have, we go over 2 hemispheres, 2 timelines, well, 3 or 4 timelines to be perfectly honest. So if we do plan to do a live stream, I would like to take into account everybody's timelines, meet somewhere in the middle. Bearing in mind, we're going from the UK all the way to New Zealand, over to America. So we've got quite a few timelines in there, like on all hemispheres. So we'll work that out when we get closer to it. Probably be in the next week or so, all being well. Right. So it'll be chapter 14 I'm doing today. Hopefully in a couple of days it'll be chapter 15. Then another couple of days it'll be the first half of chapter 16. And then we'll do the live stream. Or we can just do one whole chapter of chapter 16. Anyway, let me know what you think, though. Do you have any time suggestions? Do you have any day suggestions? As I said, we've got another couple of chapters. Essentially, if we look at it, we've got one chapter we're doing today, and then we've got essentially chapter 15, chapter 16 part 1, chapter 16 part 2. So that's 3 chapters. So by probably this time next week, we'll be ready to plan and agree the date and time that we're going to do the finale, right? You've all got a say in it. Happy to work with you, absolutely, because you are my lovely beans and I appreciate you and I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for you. And yes. Right, I'm going to stop waffling now because it's nearly 3 minutes and that's far too long for me to be waffling before the chapter, isn't it? So... Chapter 14 of Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages. We'll waffle a bit more afterwards. J.W. Wells and Co. Book 7, Chapter the 14th. Woo! The old man sighed and looked out of his bathroom window. The view from there was always the same. Blue skies, bright sunlight, just as the sitting room window always looked out on thick white cloud. Usually he kept the curtains drawn out of consideration for passing airliners. The effect on a pilot of a glimpse of the old man brushing his teeth at 30,000 feet could easily be catastrophic. He pottered down the stairs into his tiny kitchen and made himself a strong cup of tea the hard way, using a kettle instead of a word and a snap of the fingers. Narrator's note, there is only one way to make a cup of tea, and it's with a kettle. Not a microwave, a kettle. I digress. Theoretically, the result could be the same either way, but he fancied that shortcut-made tea always came out a little bit too milky and too pale. He conjured up a cinnamon biscuit, changed his mind, and transformed it into a small slice of lemon drizzle cake. Something was missing, he realised. Missing, presumed wrong. He wandered back into the sitting room and immediately realised what it was. There was an empty space on the mantelpiece, and behind it, a rectangle of paint slightly less faded. He pulled open a drawer and took out the framed photograph he'd hidden away when he'd realised young Stanley was on his way to pay him a visit. A large woman in early middle age with a huge smile. He put it back where it belonged. To Theo, with all my love, from Karina. Innocuous enough, but probably just as well if Stanley didn't see it. A boy's mother should be above suspicion, and Stanley had remarkable powers of insight and intuition. Got them from his old man, the old man thought fondly. He glanced at the clocks on the wall, made the necessary conversions effortlessly in his head. Above all, he wished he could be sure he was doing the right thing. Help. Help. A chicken had written that. Picked it with its beak. He'd watched it do it. Of course, it could be entirely random, and if his phone had been an old-fashioned typewriter, and if it had been monkeys rather than chickens, and the message had read, to be or not to be, that is the... He'd have dismissed it from his mind and thought no more of it. But a chicken. That was different. He looked round and identified the bird in question. Easily done, since it had been a cockerel, and all the others he could see were hens. It was standing on one leg about 10 yards away, looking at him. Small, scrawny looking, its comb pale and drooping. His mother had kept chickens for a while, so he knew a bit about them. This one was a pretty poor specimen, one for the pot rather than for breeding, and it was holding unnaturally still. Help, he thought. He cleared his throat. Chicken, he said. The bird seemed to hesitate. Then, very cautiously, it came towards him, watching him with furious concentration. Chicken, he repeated. Can you understand me? No, probably not. To a bird's ear, his voice would come across as a huge, shapeless roar, drawn out and booming. He cleared the screen of his phone, typed in hello, and laid it slowly on the ground. Then he backed off 4 strides and waited. It took the chicken a long time to make up its mind, but in the end it came, stood over the phone, looked down at it, pecked the casing, scratched a little dust over it, pecked its own wing feathers, then looked at the word on the screen. Mr. Goggety waited, taking long, deliberate breaths. Then the chicken pecked the keypad 4 times, scuttled away, stopped, and turned round again. Mr. Goggety sighed. In a way it was rather wonderful, this unique moment of cross-species diplomacy. On the other hand, unless they found a way of doing without all the preliminaries, it could take a very long time. Help. A chicken with a limited vocabulary. He tapped in, yes, how, put the phone down and waited. Peck, peck, peck. Much quicker this time. He peered down at the result. Don't know. A chicken that could do apostrophes. Oh, now that was impressive. A thought suddenly struck him, rather as though Newton had been sitting under a coconut palm rather than an apple tree at the relevant moment. He retrieved the phone and tapped in, "Are you human?" Mercifully, the chicken had got past all that backing away and acting scared stuff. 3 pecks. Yes. Mr. Goggety's mouth had gone dry. Usually it was a joyful thing, the sudden, unexpected impact of intuition, the gleam of light, the flash of gold in the mud-filled pan of routine analysis. This time it made him feel shaky and slightly sick. Impossible, he thought. It wouldn't count. It'd be cheating. On the other hand, what happened to you? He tapped in quickly. The reply took a little while. No idea. He grabbed the phone and started to type. He got as far as, "Who are you?" Then stopped, erased all that and wrote, "Are you Kevin Briggs?" He didn't need the confirmation of the reply. Quite suddenly he knew not just how Mr. Briggs had got here or where this was or why he'd been turned into a chicken. Far more than that. It's no good guessing, he'd told Don and Polly Mere. You've got to know. And now he did. After all the fuss, it was simple, really. And cheating, of course. The chicken, who was also Mr. Briggs, was typing again. "Can you get me out of here? Please." That brought him up short. He took the phone and wrote, "What about all the others?" Human too. Well, lawyers. The chicken was looking at him with those round red eyes, a plea he somehow couldn't resist. The answer could wait. He took the phone, hit a few keys, inadvertently struck the wrong one and started a game of Minesweeper, cleared it, got back to the message screen and finished typing, "It's all right, leave it to me." He thought, just briefly, about calling up his tariff of charges and standard new client agreement, but what the hell? If he was right about all of this, Mr. Huss would pay. In fact, money would never ever be relevant again.
Maybe he was feeling hot,
Don said. Polly looked at him. He'll suffocate in there, she said. You've got to get him out. Don stayed exactly where he was. He'd seen the way the fridge had bulged, the sheet metal sides ballooning until the doorway was big enough for Mr. Goggerty to scramble in, and then he'd watched it deflate. It couldn't do that, of course. Steel has a tensile strength and a shearing point. He could find them in a book or look them up through Google. Stretched that far, it would stay stretched. Only it hadn't.
He's a professional, he muttered. I'm sure he can look after himself.
Yes, Polly snarled. But a professional what? He didn't actually say. Don shrugged.
I don't know. Magician.
Polly made a noise like a bursting tyre. Sorry, she said, but I think you've gone way past rabbits out of hats, and the 7 of clubs is in your top right-hand pocket. He could be dying in there.
I don't think so, Don said. Surely he'd bang on the door or something.
Open the bloody fridge, Don.
You do it.
No, she said. It's not my fridge.
You have my unqualified permission.
They stood and looked at it. A fridge is just a fridge.
I'm guessing, Don said, that it's some kind of interdimensional portal.
It could be. What's an interdimensional portal?
I have no idea.
He took one step forward, then stopped.
He took the pencil sharpener.
So? Don shrugged.
He'll be all right if he's got that with him. We don't need to worry. It's none of our...
Polly pushed past him and reached for the fridge door handle. Don, she said, it feels warm.
When he comes out, Don said thoughtfully, he can tell us if the light stays on.
Mr. Goggerty? Polly waited. No reply. Don, he's not answering. He must be in trouble.
Not if I'm right, and it's an interdimensional portal. He could be anywhere by now, in a completely different space-time continuum, for all we know.
Polly took her hand away from the handle and stepped back. You'd better open it, she said. He had to ask.
Why?
Dawn, she said. A human life is in danger.
Yes, mine. Didn't you hear what I just said? If that thing's what I think it is,
it's a fridge, Dawn. What are you afraid of? Frostbite?
If...
he repeated slowly. Their father used to do that when she interrupted him, and she'd always hated it.
That thing is what I think it is. I could end up anywhere, or anywhen, come to that. I think Mr. Goggerty used it to go somewhere. Probably somewhere he couldn't get to by any other means. I think this fridge leads somewhere. Maybe the place I sent Kevin Briggs to. The difference is Goggerty's a professional and presumably knows what he's doing. If I go there, how in God's name am I ever going to get back?
Dawn, said his sister, open the fucking fridge. A man can argue only so long. Sooner or later he does what he's told, if only to get some peace. But there was more to it than that. To boldly go where no man has gone before, except Mr. Goggerty, of course, and maybe Kevin Briggs and perhaps some other people he didn't know about. To boldly go where not many people have gone before, to see what's out there, to know. Up till now he'd been fighting the stuff whose name began with M for all he was worth, because it wasn't natural, it wasn't right, because it was totally unfamiliar, and so, quite reasonably, he was frightened of it. But no longer. He wasn't sure why, but suddenly his personal safety didn't seem quite so all-important, not compared with the opportunity that life was seeing fit to rub his nose in. Well, he thought, why not? He'd just take a quick look, to satisfy his curiosity. He reached out and took hold of the door handle. Polly had been quite wrong about it. Not hot, cold as ice. Dawn, he heard her say, be careful. Oh, for crying out loud, he thought, and opened the door. He opened the door before her very eyes. It did it again. The fridge swelled up like a bubble, like a paper bag you blow into and then burst. Dawn, don't, she shouted, but it was too late. Like a man in a trance, her idiot brother took a long step forward and went inside. She lunged for the door, but too late. It had already shut behind him, and the fridge was back to its normal proportions. "Dawn!" she yelled, and yanked it open. Inside, she saw 6 eggs, 6 cans of Stella Artois, 2 tomatoes, a pat of butter, and a few crumbs of Stilton cheese in cling film, a half-empty jar of olives, and an elderly-looking cucumber. As he walked through the door, a bell rang, like in a shop. He swung round, but the door had shut behind him, a shop door with a glass panel through which he could see pavement. He threw himself against it, rattling the glass, but it wouldn't budge. Then he tried turning the handle, but that didn't work either. The door would not open. Oh, he thought. He turned and looked round. He knew this place. A counter, and behind it a rack of claws, all done up in blue polythene. He grabbed at a book of tickets on the counter in front of him. On each of them was printed "Speedy Clean" over a number. So that's what an interdimensional portal looks like, he thought. No swirly lights, slow-mo, dry ice. One moment you're in one place, the next you're somewhere else. No frills like a low-cost airline. Nobody trying to sell you socks or filled baguettes while you're hanging round waiting for something to happen. Serious travel, in other words, for serious people. A category, he reflected, into which I don't really fit.
"Hello?" he called out. "Mr. Goggerty?"
No answer. Now, he hadn't expected one. Better than even money that they'd gone, or been sent, to different locations. He moved his head a little to one side and sniffed. He could have sworn he smelled cheese. Stilton, his favourite.
"Hello?" he repeated. "Shop? Anybody there?"
Apparently not. On the shelf behind the counter, he saw a large, grubby-looking red ledger, corners bruised, pages well thumbed. He opened it and turned the pages back until he found what he'd expected to find. Miss P. Mayer, one dress, clean, mend and press. Thought so. It was the dry cleaners, the one that had suddenly vanished. Magic, he remembered, had retrieved Polly's dress from here and delivered it to the flat. Worth a try. He pulled out a hair and blew on it. Nothing happened, but of course it wouldn't. Mr. Goggerty had the pencil sharpener and so presumably was now the master of all its extraordinary powers. Bit of a waste since Mr. Goggerty had no hair. The cheese smell reminded him that it had been a long time since he'd had anything to eat. It seemed sadly trivial-minded to worry about food at a time like this. It depended on how long he was likely to be here, though. If the answer to that question was, for example, forever and ever and ever, the food issue would be far from trivial. It stood to reason that the people who ran the shop had access to food, but they weren't here, were they? A kitchen, he thought, or a larder, or even a control centre or bridge. Taking a deep breath, he set off to explore. 10 minutes later, he was back where he started. He had found a kitchen, and in it a bread bin, and in that a couple of slightly stale brown rolls for which he was truly thankful. No sign of a command centre, but loads of cleaning plant and machinery, together with a main bedroom, a spare bedroom, a bathroom, a living room, which reminded me of Uncle Jim and Auntie Pauline's house, shudder, a cupboard under the stairs, full of coats and scarves, and a downstairs loo. Not exactly the TARDIS. If it wasn't for the fact that the front door was still firmly shut, he had found a hammer in the cupboard under the stairs, but hadn't had any effect on the door glass. He could always have believed he was in a perfectly ordinary dry cleaner's somewhere in the real world, which would have been nice. Something else that appeared to be functioning within normal parameters was his bladder, which was making a bid for his urgent attention. He'd done his best to ignore it for several minutes, but action would be required quite soon. Weighing in someone else's house without asking first offended every convention he lived by. There was something inherently wrong with the idea. It was practically criminal, breaking and urinating. But, by the same token, so was helping himself to brown rolls from the kitchen. The owners wouldn't mind, he told himself. It's much easier to convince yourself of ethically dubious propositions when your legs are tightly crossed. More to the point, they'd never know. Awkwardly, But quickly he retraced his steps to the downstairs toilet, barged open the door and pulled it shut behind him and... "George," said Eileen, "I want to go home." They'd been walking for hours and their feet were sore. It had been a long time since they'd walked more than a few yards or on any surface other than slightly threadbare carpet. The sun was still shining, but a few clouds had started to drift in, long, high, flat clouds that looked as though they'd been sat on by overweight angels. Eileen didn't seem to have noticed that they had been walking in circles all the time, and they were now back at the foot of the farm drive. Mercifully, no sign of the savage attack chickens.
"Me too,"
George said, and realised rather to his own surprise that he meant it. 24 hours ago, his dearest wish would have been to escape from the shop and never go back, never to press another shirt or stare at the same implacably unchanging walls. He'd probably have stuck to his resolution if they'd been in a town with proper pavements and buildings and lashings of people. The countryside, however, was different. It was big and empty and scary, and he wished it would go away. Think of all the nice houses you could build in a wilderness like this. "I've had about enough of this walk."
"Can't be too far now,"
he replied diplomatically. "When we get home," Eileen said, "I'm going to have a nice strong cup of tea and put my feet up." He could try explaining, he thought, but what useful purpose would it serve?
"Me too,"
he said.
"Maybe a nice hot bath."
"Did you remember to turn the immersion on?"
"Yes."
He lied, and felt guilty about it, even though it couldn't possibly matter.
"There'll be plenty of hot water. You can have a nice bath and wash your hair."
"I'd like that." She came to a halt and looked at him as though searching for something she had lost. "Do you think we did something wrong?" she said.
"What?"
"Oh, this." She made a small gesture with her hands that nevertheless adequately indicated the entire universe. "Do you think it's because we did something wrong? You know, something bad?" It was the first time either of them had said it out loud.
"No,"
he said, with practically no hesitation.
"No, we're not bad people. It's just some stuff, that's all."
He frowned, trying to think of comparables.
"Like a burst water main,"
he said.
"or the plagues of Egypt in the Bible. I think somebody else somewhere may have done something bad, and we got sort of swept up in it, or maybe it's just one of those things."
She nodded, relieved to have her analysis confirmed. "Do you think it's over now?" Hopeful, like a small kid in a car. Are we nearly there yet? They should make up a new range of words for times like this, he thought. Words that mean the same things, but with the nasty sharp edges taken off.
"Wouldn't have thought so,"
he replied.
"but you never know."
"Here, George." She grabbed his arm. "We're back at that chicken place again." Again? He'd hoped she wouldn't notice. After all, they'd already been past it half a dozen times since the incident, but she hadn't been paying attention. Women don't take in their surroundings the way men do. Narrator's note: I believe this to be false, because I can read a map and I have great spatial awareness, so I can always find my way back to where I've gone, even if it would involve a farm of murderous chickens. I digress. Back to the story.
"So we are,"
he said. "Come on," she muttered. "Let's go back the way we just came. If those bloody chickens are still running about loose."
"I don't think they are. I can't see them anywhere."
"There's one. Look." Her arm shot out like a harpoon into a whale, and she pointed. "There, see, near that man."
"What man?"
"That one there, see. Tall black man with a bald head." Of course, there are times when men are so busy taking in their surroundings that they overlook the howlingly obvious.
"Oh, him,"
he said, and then the description registered. She peered more closely, wishing very much he'd thought to bring his glasses. "George," Eileen said urgently, "let's go back."
"Just a second, love."
Yes, now we'd seen him properly, as it were, there was no possibility of mistaken identity. The tall man standing by the big clump of nettles talking to a chicken was the same one who'd called to see him, the scary one who'd promised...
"Hang on,"
he thought.
"He's talking to a chicken."
Well, so what? People talk to animals, cats, Dogs, budgies, goldfish even. Nothing weird or sinister about that. His gran on his mother's side, what's he doing now? Good question. He looked like he was typing something into a little gadget he was holding in his hand. Now he was bending down and putting the gadget on the ground, and the chicken was stooping like it was reading what he'd written. Only chickens can't read, of course. And now it was pecking at the thing like it was typing in a reply, and the man was picking it up and reading it.
Let's go back,
he said firmly.
Come on.
But Eileen didn't seem to hear him. That man might know what's going on, she said. You could ask him. George's heart withered inside his chest. Men don't ask. It's the rules. Correction, men don't ask strangers. But the tall man wasn't a stranger. Furthermore, he was from the council or something of the sort, which made him official, so that was all right. And maybe he did know what was going on at that. He seemed pretty clued up the last time.
Good idea,
George said.
You wait here while I just... Bad suggestion?
Not likely, Eileen said briskly. You're not leaving me here with all them chickens wandering about. There's also a rule that says women are allowed to be afraid of animals. They can make as much fuss as they like, and you are not allowed to tell them to pull themselves together or get a grip. It's one of those complicated rules, like men have to carry the suitcase at airports, but opening doors is male chauvinism.
All right then, he conceded. You know what? He added. I think I may have seen him before somewhere.
Don't be silly, Eileen replied. They're allowed to say things like that too. The man, Mr. Goggerty, George remembered, was concentrating so hard on typing into his gadget that he didn't realise he had company until George did some rather theatrical coughing, at which point he spun around like a ballet dancer and stared.
Hello, George said brightly. Mr. Goggerty, isn't it?
A split second. Mr. Goggerty was clearly an intelligent, perceptive man. He saw Eileen, registered the complication and said, That's right, and you're Mr. He made a pantomime of trying to remember. Mr. Williams, he said, from the dry cleaners in Clevedon Road.
Fancy you remembering, George said. You must have a really good memory. Eileen, this is Mr. Goggerty, who came into our shop once. Mr. Goggerty, this is my wife, Eileen.
Enough with the play acting, said Mr. Goggerty's eyebrows. Pleased to meet you, he said. May I ask
what we're doing here?
George grinned sadly.
Funnily enough, I was wondering if you could tell me.
The chicken clucked. If it had been human, it would have sounded annoyed. Eileen jumped and looked terrified, and George had a flash of inspiration.
Get back, Eileen, he said. We'll protect you.
Eileen backed away 10 yards, her eyes fixed on the chicken's beak. Nice, muttered Mr. Goggerty, clearly impressed. All right, what are you doing here?
Dunno,
George whispered back.
The shop came here. We thought we'd go for a walk, and when we tried to find it again, it'd gone.
Mr. Goggerty looked at him sharply. Gone?
Gone. Vanished. We've been walking round in circles ever since.
He frowned, added,
We keep going in a straight line, but we always end up here. It's like...
That's right, Mr. Goggerty said. It's because it's what we call a pocket universe. Infinite, like the real universe, but curved. George gave him his number one blank look. Sorry, Mr. Goggerty said, thinking aloud. Oh, sorry, this is Kevin Briggs.
What?
The chicken clucked angrily, dislodging the penny, which dropped with terrible force.
What? That?
George said.
That's
as human as you or me, Mr. Goggerty said. In fact, he came into your shop once. Actually, he added, I rather think that's why he's here.
Imagine the multiverse, Mr. Horse read, as a series of concentric spheres, a set of spherical Russian dolls packed inside each other. Each universe comprised in the multiverse is by definition infinite. Each universe is curved in accordance with basic Einsteinian metaphysics.
Mr. Horse paused and scratched his head. He wasn't a great reader at the best of times, and Mr. Goggerty's article in the autumn 1972 edition of Supernature was rather hard-going. Still, he was beginning to get a glimmer of the basic idea.
Each universe is infinite. How, then, can one fit inside another? To argue thus, we contend, is to allow ourselves to be confined within the bounds of a crudely materialist mindset, to envisage the boundaries of universes to be hard, solid, like the shell of an egg, instead of a shell. Let that boundary be a balloon, capable of inflating and shrinking, and yet remaining essentially the same. If a universe is truly infinite, of course it can accommodate itself inside another universe. Come to that, inside a football or a peanut shell. Infinite doesn't just mean infinitely big. Infinite also encompasses infinitely small. The egg metaphor begs the great teleological question, which came first? But for that question to have any semblance of meaning, Mr. Horse groaned, reached for his sandwich, peeled off the top slice of bread, shook a half-dozen aspirins from the bottle on top of the amply mustarded roast beef, replaced the bread and bit largely. Such was his remarkable constitution that he could eat aspirin like sweets. Narrator's note, do not do this at home. Back to the story, and come to no harm. Such was his bizarrely different physiology that he could munch aspirins all day without any effect on his headache. Still, it did no harm to try. He skipped a page and tried again. Let us consider Soslowich's fifth proposition. What, he asks, is an egg but a compilation of ingredients, water, calcium, proteins, drawn from the body of the hen, matured inside her and expelled in the act of laying. Although the egg is not the whole chicken, the egg is wholly made up from the chicken. At the instant of laying, every part of it is derived from the chicken. Thus, by any meaningful criteria, the egg is the chicken, or at least of the chicken, and the separateness that ensues from the act of parturition is merely the separateness that ensues from the act of parturition is merely a geographic irrelevance. If a man's arm is cut off, Soslowich argues the arm is still a component of the man's body. That the egg then proceeds to hatch into a wholly separate life form is beside the point. Even the newly hatched chick is wholly composed of its mother until it takes its first externally derived bite of food and sip of water. Soslovich ignores the fact that the eggshell is permeable and therefore air not supplied by the mother is absorbed by the chick from the moment of laying. Naughty Soslovich, Mr. Horse thought. In fact, he was so cross with Soslovich he skipped the whole of the rest of the page just to teach him a lesson. It therefore follows that the egg inside the chicken is entirely comparable to the concentric universe inside the multiverse. An egg, containing an unborn chicken, is in itself an infinity of possibilities. Within its first 60 seconds of life, the chick might stand up, or sit down, turn right or left, cheap or not cheap. In its entire lifetime, the chick encompasses an infinity, a universe of potential choices, of moments when the continuum bifurcates and new universes are formed, each infinite but contained within the other, like our spherical Russian dolls. The hen is, by the same token, equally infinite, but when she contains the egg, she contains the future infinity that will soon be the chick. Therefore, to ask the question which came first is to ignore that Mr. Horse yawned and turned back to the list of contents at the front of the journal. Someone, the editor presumably, had put it rather well. Page 376. Soslovich reconsidered the argument from internality. A nice try by Stanley Goggerty. Indeed, a nice try, but drivel nonetheless. Mr. Horse closed the journal, ate the rest of his sandwich, glanced at his watch. It's 5:15, the time when, according to his usual routine, they brought in the day's letters to check and sign. His fingers itched for the pen, the way a missing tooth sometimes aches. The office felt very big and empty, with just him in it. He had no choice, however. Sack the lot of them. It'd been the only way. Close down the entire business, cancel all the contracts, pay them all off, every single one. He winced at the thought. A few days ago, before it all went wrong, he'd been a rich man, so rich he had no idea how much money he'd got. Now, having bought himself out of all his liabilities, he was left with about £50,000 sterling, say $100,000, an evocative figure, he couldn't help thinking. $100,000 plus the clothes he stood up in. The difference this time was that he didn't have a little brass ring, slightly worn on one side.
Big difference. He sat very still and listened. Now, there are a few places on Earth as quiet as a fully soundproofed modern office suite with nobody in it, and the phones all disconnected, and the computers and air conditioning switched off, and nobody using the plumbing. You could have heard a pin drop, except there was nobody around to drop a pin. Mr. Horse frowned. Maybe he could ring the job centre and hire someone to come in and drop pins, just to ease the silence. Better not, though. He couldn't really afford indulgences like that anymore. He still had Stan Goggarty's bill to pay, and he had an idea that $100,000 would only just cover it. No, believe that. Symmetry demanded that $100,000 would cover it exactly, leaving him with nothing, because that was how it should be. Often he'd wondered why he'd had the money bestowed upon him when he was put there in the Caucasus for the monks to find. Now he knew. It was to pay Mr. Goggarty's bill when the time came. The implication being that the time had now come, which it had. No questions about that. Jack Tedeschi had been the first of many business associates, past and present, baying for his blood because the slab of real estate they'd bought from him had suddenly vanished. Going on was out of the question. He reached in his pocket, got out his phone, and accessed his bank account. $100,036.72. Not quite then. He still had $36.72 of time left then, which came as a relief. If he spent it carefully, it could buy him a couple of days, long enough anyhow for a cup of coffee. He went to the staff kitchen, filled the kettle and switched it on, then remembered that the electricity had been cut off. He sighed. There were still 4 ginger nuts in the biscuit jar. He ate them, washing them down with water. He looked around, remembering when this room had been filled with people at all times. People making themselves drinks, drinking them, chatting, doing faces and nails, getting changed ready for the night out, storing shopping in the fridge, reading magazines when they should have been at their desks working. He'd come a long way from the Caucasus, but geographical irrelevances excluded, he was right back where he started, because infinity is curved, he supposed, and according to Stan Goggarty, I'm just an egg inside a chicken. So what would I know anyhow? It was all the brass ring's fault. Easy enough to say when it wasn't here to defend itself. He thought about that thought, and decided that you can take fair-mindedness too far. It hadn't actually ever talked to him in a creepy Joan of Arc sort of way, but he'd been keenly aware of it in his mind, as a personality, a reminder of his origins. He liked to fool himself, but more than that. You could do this, it would urge. You could do that, and this and that had turned out to involve using the M stuff, folding the space-time continuum like those cut-out paper dolls holding hands so that he could sell the same plots of land over and over and over again, hiring a dozen people to sit behind one desk simultaneously in a reality layered like phyllo pastry. How malleable he'd been, how easily led. You could do this and that. Eat the nice apple, said the brass serpent, with its tail in its mouth. It'll do you good.
What did I know? He asked himself. I'm just a poor orphan boy from the Caucasus. A brass ring tells me to fold space and time. I do it. Rude not to.
And now the brass ring had gone. Left him alone to clear up the mess and put everything back where he'd got it from, moved on presumably to a more efficient and satisfactory carrier. He walked slowly back to the front office where, on the reception desk, he saw a letter. He was fairly sure it hadn't been there before, but he could have been mistaken.
Dear sir, the letter said, please find enclosed our invoice for powdered coffee supplied to your good selves between the following dates.
He translated from sterling into US dollars. $36.72.
All right then.
He wrote out a cheque, put it in an envelope, stamped it with his last stamp, found nesting in the back of his wallet, where he also found a £5 note and some loose change, 72 pence.
Goodbye, office,
he said aloud, and walked down the street, where a taxi happened to be waiting.
Where to?
The driver asked.
A fiver's worth,
Mr. Horse replied.
Wherever that takes me, that's the place.
The driver looked at him.
Quicker to walk, he said.
Mr. Horse scowled at him.
Here's £5, he said. Here's the tip.
He dropped the coins through the open window.
Now fucking well drive.
The driver looked at him again, and there was a split second when he seemed to understand. He nodded, and Mr. Horse got in and sat down. They drove for a very long time, westward to the M40, past Oxford and Warwick, the M42 to join the M5, leaving at the Kidderminster Junction and cross-country from there.
Are we nearly there yet?
Mr. Horse asked. He glanced at his watch, according to which the journey had lasted 3 minutes. Outside the window, hedgerows and green fields blurred past, with a background of big round hills. "Welcome to Elgar country," shouted a road sign. Mr. Horse didn't know who Elgar was. Wasn't that the name of the famous racehorse that got stolen? But he had the strangest feeling of familiarity, of homecoming, which was odd, since he'd never been here before in his life, as far as he knew. Down little lanes with grass growing up the middle. 3.5 minutes now. The sun agreed with his watch. It showed no inclination to set, but instead shone brightly in the spaces between flat, squashed-looking clouds. A cottage or two. A church. The taxi stopped.
"We're here,"
the driver said. Mr. Horse nodded and opened the door. Grass under his feet. At his side, the yellow stone of the churchyard wall.
"Where the hell are we?"
he asked.
"Norton St. Edgar,"
the driver replied, and drove away.
"Fine,"
Mr. Horse shouted at the rear of the disappearing taxi.
"I can walk the rest of the way from here."
Marvellous. He didn't like walking at the best of times, and his shoes were too tight. He looked down and realised he'd just trodden in something bucolic. Well, he thought, so this is Norton St. Edgar. Nice place. No wonder so many people were so keen to live here. Wiping his shoe carefully on a tuft of grass, he considered the view. Pretty, he decided. Nice hills and stuff. Really, it would be a shame to build houses all over it. Apparently, though, that hadn't happened. The magic of the plain brass ring, which had folded the universe for him and kept it folded after he'd taken the money and moved on, had all faded away now. He wondered where all the houses had gone to, and the people living in them. If he'd understood what Stan Gogarty had said in the Learned Journal, each house he'd built was basically an egg floating anomalously in time and space, in which case they ought to start hatching any moment now. That wasn't a cheerful thought, and he threw it out of his mind like a bouncer ejecting a drunk, but it came back almost immediately and brought a load of its rowdy friends along with it. Exactly what had happened to all those people? If, as he'd always assumed, the magic had been keeping them in place and the magic had stopped working, what then? He realised he had absolutely no idea. Appalling. He felt his forehead and realised he was sweating, as well as he might. All those people. He felt in his pocket and found something. A coin, snuggled in a fold of his hanky. He took it out and looked at it. 1 penny. He laughed. Not quite yet, then. He turned his head like a battleship's gun turret and took a proper look at the landscape. Once he'd reduced it to an Ordnance Survey 2-dimensional shape, contour lines and salient features, it was entirely familiar. It ought to be. He'd divided it up and parcelled it out into lots often enough. He couldn't begin to remember the names of all the streets he'd built on that shape over the years. Dozens of them, maybe 100. He grinned like a dog. A town, practically a city, but nothing to see. Nothing an archaeologist could sink a trowel into. That reminded him. He'd seen a telly programme once about archaeology, with the little scruffy man from Blackadder scampering energetically in the mud. Cities, you remember, tend to come in layers, like a Big Mac. Take a really old city. It's made up of loads of different layers, where each generation is built on top of the ruins of its predecessors. Dig a vertical shaft and you can see them, like strata in rock, dozens of streets, maybe 100, all piled on top of each other, all occupying the same ground but separated by time. Seen from above, from the air, just one. Seen from the side, lots. On a map or a development plan or the plan attached to a transfer deed, you only get the bird's eye view. What he'd done was essentially the same thing time did, except accelerated. He frowned and scratched an itch behind his ear. He had an idea he'd hit on something, a stray fragment of the explanation, but he knew he wasn't capable of recognising it for what it was. Stan Gogarty would get it. He'd know what it meant. But of course, he wasn't here. He shook his head. One moment a load of eggs floating in space, the next a slice of layer cake. Given human beings' innate need to think in metaphors, it was remarkable they'd contrived to achieve anything at all. All those poor people trapped in collapsed archaeological strata, like earthquake victims. In Baldrick's ruined city, as previously noted, the superimposed levels were kept apart by time. Here it had been magic, some trick or other powered by the brass ring, which strongly implied that all of the king's horses and all of the king's men couldn't dig the poor buggers out again.
My fault,
he thought. Once, at an airport, waiting for a plane, he'd bought a copy of Dr. Faustus. It had been an honest mistake. He thought it was the book of that film with Omar Sharif and the famous shot where he opens the cattle truck door, and by the time he realised what he'd done, he was 20,000 feet above the Atlantic. So he'd read it. And pretty weird it turned out to be. There was a scene at the end where the hero was waiting for the devil to come and get him, and this had stuck in his mind like a bit of sweet corn skin lodged between the front teeth.
Ah, Faustus, thou hast one bare hour to live, and then thou must be damned eternally.
1 hour. 1 penny. He opened his hand and looked at it. The Queen was on the back, but she looked away, unwilling to meet the eye of the man responsible for hundreds of innocent people getting buried alive in metaphysical shoe pastry. He considered repenting, but that had never been his style.
To hell with it,
he thought, and chucked the penny into the hedge. Then he waited for something to happen. He waited and waited, and then he felt something tapping on the toe of his left shoe. He looked down. There was a chicken, pecking at the stitching of his handmade lob of St. James's brown brogues. Very gently he nudged it away.
Go on, chicken,
he said.
Shoo.
The chicken took no notice. Peck, peck, peck. Not that it mattered any more, but each precision-aimed beak strike was taking about a £5 off the value of his footwear. A lesser man would have swung his leg back and booted the chicken into Worcestershire, but Mr. Horse restrained himself. Far from holding the moral high ground, he was down on the moral floodplain, cricking his neck back to see the encircling peaks. He withdrew his foot gently, out of pecking range, and in the process taken a step back. The chicken set to work on his right foot. He sighed and gave ground once again. The chicken advanced. He retreated. It was silly. A former master of the universe being backed into a hedge by a barnyard fowl. But he accepted it with patient resignation, as befitted a man without a penny to his name. Only when his back was to the hazel branches and the bramble tendrils were nuzzling his collar did he stop and hold his ground.
Fine, he said. Eat my shoes. See if I care.
The chicken took one last peck, lifted its head, twitched it the way chickens do. I've got a message for you, it said.
Oh, hell, he thought. Now I'm listening to talking chickens.
And then he paused and thought about it. He reflected on how he'd always been able to understand any language, just hearing the words, not realising he was being talked to in foreign until the matter emerged from context. Human languages, animal languages. He'd never been conscious of understanding birdsong and beast grunt before, but maybe that was just because he had not been listening. The mind blots out the voices it can't be bothered with, the background chatter, the involuntary eavesdrops. Maybe, when he'd strolled in the park or down the street, some of those voices hadn't been strictly human.
"Chicken?" he said.
"My name," the chicken replied icily, "is Mary Byron. I have a message for you from Stanley Gogarty."
Oh, that was a challenge. I challenge you to say Gogarty and chicken speak. Oh my goodness gracious, that was so much fun. Oh, right. Okay. So, if you could have a ponder, let's say let's say a week on Friday, okay, if all being well, or even Saturday, so Friday or Saturday, let's ponder on a time. And if you want to do this live stream, and as I said, I'll probably make some sort of graphic to so I probably won't be on video, but I'll definitely be on audio, like a podcast, as it were, just of the recording process. And believe me, it's not going to be perfect. There are sounds. But if you'd like to join in and come along, then by all means, you're welcome. You're absolutely welcome, and I appreciate every single one of you that listens very, very much. But yeah, and then we'll have the chat going on. I probably won't be able to respond to it while we're actually, throughout it, but you can all talk to each other at the same time, and it'd be lovely. So I'm thinking a Friday or a Saturday. Probably Saturday will be more accessible for more people, but it's the time we've got to think about, obviously, for the time zones. So, but yeah, if you would like to be there, it'd be awesome to have you there. But if it's not your jam, that's cool, because the chapter will come out anyway. But yes, I will stop going and Don't you just hate it when you're listening to somebody on the TV making an announcement, or on a podcast or an audio or something, and they haven't drunk enough water, so they're smacking their lips and they're going ums and ahs a lot, and the smacking the lips is what I can't deal with. I'm like, no, But I just cannot listen or hear people eat. I have that thing where it's abhorrent to me. The thing is, I'm quite tolerant about it, because it's not my business what people are eating and all that sort of thing. I normally remove myself, or just the meal will be over shortly. But it's not so easy when you're working in an office, when people do make the worst noises you've ever heard eating. That was unbearable. But mukbang is probably my absolute worst nightmare. Well, for kind of like for sounds and things. Well, one of them maybe. I don't know why I've gone off on this tangent. I must apologise. So, let's get back to the train of the conversation. If you would like to be there, please, by all means, suggest a time that would be good, that would work out. As I said, we're going on the two main hemispheres, so we're literally probably working 12 hours apart at the most. And yeah, I think finding somewhere in the middle would be good for everybody. But it's up to you. So far it's looking like you guys do want us to do this stream, which would be awesome. And of course, I'm happy to work with you. I'll just keep that day clear as best I can. Yes. So thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this recording, please hit the like button. If you want to hit the notifications bell so it goes bing, bing, bing. New chapters coming along. Doo-doo. As always, let me know how you're doing, how things are going, how you are. And, in case you didn't know, I do have a whole ton of books on Audible. If you would like to have a free listen to any of the books that I have in my catalogue, then please drop me a line via the email on the contact page of my YouTube channel. If you want to drop a rating or an honest review, that would be awesome, because it always helps. There's about 46 books on there, 47 nearly. And at the end of the day, I appreciate you all very much for being here, so I'd like to do that for you. No, yes, because that's just how we do. Anyway, I'm going to stop whiffling on now, and I'm going to say take care of yourselves, have lots of good rest, take it easy, eat good foods and all that sort of thing. And remember, don't you open that trap door. You're a fool if you dare. Stay away from that trap door, 'cause there's something down there.
It's difficult singing that a cappella. Take it easy, Petal, and I'll see you soon.